Hello, class. This is Roger Moore. This is the summer of 2022, a presentation prepared for the Botany 474 class. This presentation is not for reuse or reproduction of any sorts, and the subject matter today we are discussing is Iboga. Iboga is native to West Central Africa. It is a powerful psychedelic. It is one of the few natural psychedelics which is known to induce deaths. So it is has a provocative bit of history and a lot of controversy surrounding it from its origin and continuing on to this day. So the culture surrounding Iboga, it's formed religions, it's the identity of masses of peoples, it's saved lives. It's done a tremendous amount of work just by existing, and so it's acted upon peoples and upon their culture for going into prehistory. So let's begin. How has the culture surrounding Iboga evolved over time? That's really the mission statement. That's the crux of this presentation, what we're trying to express and lay out formally for you. So the content of this presentation, we're going to begin with African origins. The Pygmy peoples were the first to use Iboga, the first to have a history of its extraction and its ceremonial application as a medicine, a stimulant, an aphrodisiac, all sorts of applications depending on dosage for this plant medicine. So the Bantu and Bwiti. Bantu are people, coastal people of the Gabonese, Gabonese folk, and Bwiti is the religion. It's a modern religion which is central around Iboga, or Iboga is central too. Going into how the Western world even knows about Iboga, Thomas Edward Bowditch is the first explorer to encounter it. Marie Théophile Griffon du Bellay is the first explorer and ethnobotanist to define it, describe it accurately, and bring it back to France, actually. Lambrine is the first pharmaceutical application of Iboga, and Howard Lotsof is a character, an American character, who really pioneered what modern culture thinks of today when they think of Iboga or Ibogaine. So learning objectives, things to look out for during this presentation, questions you should be able to answer. What is Iboga? How has Iboga influenced cultures, plural? How is Iboga used? And how is Iboga threatened? Because it very much is. So let's get into it. What is Iboga? Iboga is an indigenous intoxicant to Gabon. It's an evergreen bush native to West Central Africa. Congo, Gabon, Cameroon are the common places you will actually find it growing. The tree roots are what are valuable to the initiates and those practicing the Bwiti tradition. So unfortunately, a lot of plants are killed when uprooting them. However, you can take lateral roots from mature plants and save the plant, but unfortunately, it's not necessarily something that's taken into consideration when you start bringing financial markets into the use of the plant. So it's a perennial rainforest shrub, 1 to 4 meters in height, typically 1 to 2, maybe 3 meters, but there are certainly some monsters that become quite tree-like. And they aren't psychoactively active to the point where you need them to be. They're slow growing until they're kind of out of their 5-6 year juvenile stage. So when I talk about Iboga being threatened, it's growing in popularity, but it's something that, very much like peyote, takes a long time to get to a point where it is useful. So without kind of outpacing the use with replanting, its numbers become diminished and more and more so every day. It is an angiosperm, so these orange pepper-like fruits are what contain the seeds. The family Apocynaceae is the Dogbane family, and genus Tabernanthe. So Tabernanthe contains two plants, of them the Tabernanthe iboga, and the word Tabernanthe actually comes from market, hut, the Latin root taberna, and Greek flower anthos. So there's speculation as to whether or not that refers to the intoxicating effect, whether it was distributed or prepared near market stalls, etc., etc. So Pygmy origins. This is the first use we know of, and it really goes into prehistory. The Pygmy people of Central West Africa are not practicing written language. They are practicing an oral history and an oral tradition, which is passed down generation to generation. They are quite separate from other native tribes to Africa. There are genetic differences which have been pinned to diversions 50 to 90,000 years ago. So they do not experience any adolescent growth spurt. So it's not uncommon to see 3-4 foot tall adults. And you can see here, this is an image captured from 1983 of several Pygmy women encountering or interacting with a Gabonese woman. You can see she quite towers over them, although they are all mature. So 1800s coastal Bantu people were actually displaced by European conquestors. So in the establishment of African trade routes and markets by the Europeans, the Gabonese people, the coastal dwelling Bantu people, really of modern day Gabon and Cameroon, were displaced and moved further inland, and it created conflicts with the Pygmies, as now there's disputes over territory, or the Gabonese simply want to take their territory. And it's said that the Pygmies introduced Iboga to the Bantu with the hopes of it bringing forth peace and tranquility, and kind of diminishing the fighting that was now new to them and taking place. So the Bantu treated the Pygmies with violence. Pygmies introduced Bantu to Iboga in order to curb that violence. And the story passed down through the Pygmy people is that Iboga was discovered by a farmer's wife who took home a porcupine to eat, hunted it, and upon ingesting it became wildly intoxicated, had a mythical religious experience, a transcendental experience you might refer to it as, and trying to examine how it may have occurred, went back to where she had said she captured the porcupine for dinner, and there was gnawing at roots of the Iboga tree, and so they put two and two together, prepared the roots, introduced them to others, and Iboga was brought or blessed onto the Pygmy people by the porcupine. So Bantu people being forced from the coast inland, now encroaching on Pygmy lands, wind up learning traditions from the Pygmy people and incorporate them into their own lives. So this is actually the formation of the Bwiti religion. So it is several hundred years old at this point. It's not a tremendously ancient religion, and it does incorporate several bits and pieces of Western ideology or Western practice that you may see when you examine different tribes practicing it. So Bwiti spiritual practice is, as I said, a modern religion. It's one of 3 modern religions recognized by the government of Gabon. It's practiced by the forest-dwelling Fang, Punu, and Mitsogo peoples of Gabon and Cameroon today. The Bwiti, however, it's less of a religion and more of a cultural identity. It is tremendously intertwined with the ceremonial use of Iboga. A lot of their livelihood lives revolve around Iboga as a rite of passage, as a ceremony. It's given to newborns, adolescents, adults, people who are sickly. So again, it did not begin with the Bwiti people. It was very much introduced to them and taught to them by the Pygmy tribes of Central Africa. So many people believe Iboga beginning with Bwiti, but it was very much taught to them, and Bwiti was formed because of Iboga. So the video I'm about to show is actually a historic Bwiti celebration. It's recorded in the docu-series Pharmacopoeia. These clips are curated from it to try and give you a better idea of what we're really discussing, what this tradition is all about. So please enjoy these few minutes I've curated.
La vérité, on l'a pas sur le tapis rouge. La vérité, on l'a en mangeant le bois sacré qui est. L'initiation, c'est une nouvelle naissance. Voilà comment je résume ce que j'ai fait en 4 jours pour m'initier. C'est pendant 4 jours, de mercredi à dimanche. Vous ne mangez que du Iboga et vous ne prenez que de l'eau. On commence à vous administrer l'Iboga mercredi. Le jeudi, c'est le jour de sacrifice. Il y a la tombe, nous enlevons les impuretés de chair. 3e jour, le vendredi, on vous nettoie, lavez quelqu'un dans une rivière. Le samedi, on vous lave, on vous habille en blanc. Et vous devez sortir votre première parole. Dimanche, vous avez votre premier repas. Et on peut commencer à vous remettre sur pied. Et je confirme. L'Iboga, c'est quelque chose qui désenvoûte, qui purifie.
Prendre la chair, on prend les os. Parce que nous, on appelle pas ces causes, on appelle l'os de l'Iboga. L'Iboga fraîchement récolté, qui est en poudre comme celle qu'on a consommée durant les 5 jours de la veillée.
Quand vous arrivez dans son temple de Bwiti, tout se passe dans les règles et les normes fondamentales que Dieu a créées. C'est organisé. Ça ne se fait pas au hasard.
Donc nous avons toute cette organisation-là. Le temple est composé normalement de 12 membres.
Qui viennent faire l'expérience naturellement, enfant ou grand. Le cas de Bwiti, c'est la joie. On dit bonsoir à tout le monde et à tous nos invités. Bonsoir. Nous sommes là pour une grande cérémonie. Mon nom d'esprit, c'est moi, le roi David. Je suis le vétéran de ce temple, le chef de village. Je ne suis pas seul. J'ai une épouse qui s'appelle, dit, nommée la reine met les eaux spirituellement. Et bonne soirée à tous et bonne guérison pour les malades. Merci.
Parce que lorsque on initie quelqu'un, il fait au moins 5 jours sans manger quoi que ce soit. On ne lui donne que de l'Iboga et de l'eau. donner cette forte dose-là parce qu'il leur faut de l'énergie pour pouvoir tenir toute la nuit. Donc, comme tout médicament, il y a la posologie. Les bébés nouveau-nés, il y a des doses qui sont réparties. Je suis un médecin très complet. Donc il faut donner d'autres plantes pour permettre à ce qu'il y ait une bonne circulation, pas de blessures. Par exemple, la liane bruyante.
Iboga, à travers les initiations, vous montre votre véritable destin, vous montre le chemin à suivre.
So that is what a modern Bwiti ceremony looks like. And it's worth noting the Western religious iconography, the fact that the people are speaking French. They very much adopted certain aspects of their colonizers, most likely unavoidably. The religious iconography, Jesus on a cross, is in Bwiti meant to represent divinity and suffering. And so looking upon Jesus on the cross is not necessarily a biblical aspect of the practice, but more so identifying within yourself your own suffering and finding beauty and significance and godliness in that suffering. So the practice of Iboga consumption would have remained private to Central West Africa if it weren't for certain characters throughout history who have really pioneered a new understanding of the alkaloids present and in effect. So we're starting off with Thomas Edward Bowditch. He's an author, scientist, explorer from England, Marie Théophile Griffon du Bellay, an actual ethnobotanist, and Howard Lotsof, who is really the godfather of modern Ibogaine clinics and addiction treatment. So Thomas Edward Bowditch, he was a savant, a brilliant young man employed by the British government to help with peace treaties in what's modern day Ghana, so the Ashanti Kingdom. And he was the first person in 1819 to write of Iboga. So he botched the botanical details, which is understandable, being one of the first white European folk trying to interact with people speaking a language very foreign to your own and trying to understand what information they're presenting to you. So Iboga, it's unlikely he would have accidentally gotten that name right, but he believed it to be a tree fungus, not a tree root. And the quote from his book, Mission from Cape Coast Castle to Ashanti, is the eroga, a favorite but violent medicine, is no doubt a fungus, for they describe it as growing on a tree called the okambu. When decaying, they burn it first and take as much as would lay on a shilling. So he botched a few things, but he got the details right, and so he's very likely the first white person to encounter, witness, and interact with Iboga ceremonies and traditional usage. Here's a book or a illustration from his book. It's the first day of the yam custom, and there's a line in the novel that the king was surrounded by dwarves, and so that's likely a reference to the Pygmy people. They were looked at in certain circles as having magical powers, as being almost like forest nymphs. So there's a lot of segregation that took place, a lot of judgment and prejudice. Second-class citizens were very much pygmies, and so it's worth noting here that the king was surrounded by them. So here are some Pygmy people with a 1920s adventurer, European adventurer. I believe 1921 this image was captured. You can see a nursing mother, you know, barely above his waist. So obviously quite different, and must have been quite unique and interesting to have come across and get to know. And on the right here, we actually have quite a large specimen of Tabernanthe iboga. You can see how it's much larger than some of the other shrubs we've been featuring in this presentation. And now we get on to the ethnobotanist Marie Théophile Griffon du Bellay, really the reason that Iboga even left Africa. So he brought samples back to France after being employed to explore inland coastal Africa, and the samples he brought back from his 1864 voyage were displayed actually at the Paris Exposition, World's kind of fair, I believe, in 1867, and then finally housed at the Paris Museum d'Histoire Naturelle, so the Natural History Museum of Paris. He nailed the taxonomy. He coined the Tabernanthe iboga. So he is the one that is responsible for really bringing it into scientific literature rather than just having mentioned it as an aside or an interesting note in a novel about exploration. So his quotation is that taken in small quantities, it is an aphrodisiac and stimulant of the nervous system. Warriors and hunters make considerable use of it in order to stay awake during their night vigils. So the thought is that the iboga is in and of itself the actual vigil. And it's very interesting that this is a record of microdosing. So microdosing is a current wave sweeping parts of American culture and global culture as far as a productivity hack. And it's fascinating to see them employing various dosages in their use of iboga. So they were very accustomed to its consumption and the effects. So they brought it back, Griffon du Bellay brought it back to France, where it was studied and examined, and in 1901 it was the principal active alkaloid, Ibogaine or Ibogaine, was isolated from the iboga plant root. And so Jan Dubowski and Edward Landrin are the ones responsible for making that discovery. So this is what the molecule looks like. The red molecule on the left is an oxygen. The two blue are nitrogen. And it's worth noting that the nitrogen molecules are it's a telltale sign in nature when something may be worth examining and maybe able to cross the blood-brain barrier. So you see in scientific notation, amine is the nitrogen group featured twice here, and so in the top you see the ibogamine. You often hear ibogaine, and it's a bit of trivia here that the nomenclature from originally morphine, nicotine, was duplicated with coca. So cocaine was actually originally coined cocaine, ibogaine, same thing. So when you hear ibogaine, that's very much a modern, even though 99% of the people will say something like ibogaine because that is how it appears. It's very counter to how it was initially coined. Same with cocaine. So yeah, fascinating little bit of trivia. So, Ibogaine was isolated. They knew it had all sorts of applications through Africa, and it was actually marketed as a pharmaceutical, available to people in France and Europe, wildly popular in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, into the 60s. So it had decades of historied use. And the actual contents are a total plant extract of tabernanthe. So that's very interesting because it's not ibogaine or ibogaine isolated. It is the total plant alkaloids, which there are a number of ones in effect in Iboga. In 1966, unfortunately, lamberine was removed from the market. It was declared not an intoxicant, but it was actually a doping problem. So the Olympic Committee banned it as being a performance enhancer. It was a known intoxicant in high doses, and so it carried over to an actual Schedule 1 classification by the DEA. So lamberine's clinical use, the packaging describes it as a neuromuscular stimulant promoting cell combustions and getting rid of fatigue, indicated in cases of depression, asthenia, in convalescence, infectious diseases, greater than normal physical or mental efforts by healthy individuals. 2 to 4 tablets daily, rapid and prolonged action, not followed by depression, may be administered to hypertensives. So this is the microdosing regimen we were discussing, or the microdose application. So it's given to healthy individuals, not the sickly, not used as a medicine, but very much for the betterment of well people. So a drug that is designed to make us better than well. So the appearance of lamberine in early 1900s culture in France is very common. It's often referred to in literature by artists, obviously, as art authors are, but very popular within explorer communities, mountain climbers, geologists, volcanologists. Haroun Tazieff here writes in his novel Le Gouffre de Pierre Saint-Martin, it was lamberine, a stimulant, a doping agent, which was supposed to enable us to find the necessary strength in our exhausted bodies. I took another lamberine while Andre climbed up the ladder. I massaged my legs. Within 10 minutes, everything was in order, and in turn, I climbed up without any difficulty. And on this last day, this frenzied race toward our discovery, these 6 hours of descent and climbing sustained by lamberine, this day on top of all others, it was terrible. Only the stimulant enabled us to keep going. When the effect of the last tablet had passed and I had no more, I was nothing but a pitiful package of meat, miserably dangling at the end of a wire. So quite descriptive imagery coming in there throughout popular culture. And carrying on, we see Howard Lotsof becoming interested. This is pre-banning of 1966, so it's assumed he procured pharmaceutical grade Ibogaine. He was interested in it as an intoxicant. It had absolutely no known addiction interruption actions or method of function at this time. And so we get Howard Lotsof in 1962 being the first person to actually, the first heroin addict to actually experience withdrawal cessation. So he took it at a party with several friends. A couple days later, he was an active heroin user with a daily habit. The experience lasted roughly 36 hours. And after the end of it, he realized he had although not using dope in quite some time, he had no cravings. He had no desire to use it, most likely brought on by the psychedelic experience. But also there's a chemical interaction within the brain where the ibogaine is binding with mu opioid receptors. There's a lot of different methods of function. It's all speculation at this point because ibogaine is a very dirty molecule and it interacts with every neurotransmitter that we presently understand or observe in the human brain. So it has a tremendous number of methods of function as far as pharmacokinetics, how it works in biology. And so it's not necessarily known what the method is, but it is in fact binding to opioid receptors. So that is the belief. So Howard Lotsof, having noted his complete lack of desire to get back into the habit, which he inadvertently kicked, of heroin use, daily compulsive heroin use, he patented the use of Ibogaine for narcotic addiction syndrome in 1985. 1986, it went on to cocaine and amphetamines. 1989, alcohol. 1991, nicotine. So it's worth noting that the specific opioid receptors that it binds to may be important for opioid withdrawal cessation, but the ability to overcome addictions using Ibogaine is widely applicable. It is not specific to opiates or opioids. And it's also worth noting that there are no native opium does not grow in Africa, so it's completely removed from its traditional ceremonial use. So there's no heroin addicts or opium addicts in traditional indigenous Africa. So with Howard Lotsof kind of beginning this new era of Ibogaine research and understanding, it is now much more closely affiliated, if you do Google trend searches, with Ibogaine clinics rather than traditional ceremonial usage. So looking at this map, you can actually see a lack of clinics here where it appears naturally. Cameroon, Gabon, Congo, no clinics to note there, although you are able as a Westerner to participate in Bwiti ceremonies, but they are not geared towards addiction, and they are very different than the addiction clinics you may find popular in Rosarito, Mexico, St. Kitts in the Virgin Islands, and now across Europe. So the red ones, the red marks here, are quite established. The blue ones are newer, and the green ones are actually countries, Brazil, South Africa, New Zealand, that are actually legal to use. So that really wraps things up here. That brings us to modern usage. I do want to kind of express here that there's a long way to go as far as tying the traditional usage of Iboga and ceremony into modern usage. The Iboga clinics, which exist and are becoming more and more popular, oftentimes have weekend retreats. You fly in on a Friday, you trip on a Saturday, and mind you, we're talking about a 20-hour psychedelic experience, anywhere from 16 to 36 hours, honestly, in some reports, and depending on dosage and the individual. So we're talking about a tremendously packed in weekend if you're flying in on a Friday, tripping on a Saturday, and leaving on a Sunday. So it's very much removed from the traditional ceremonial usage, which will carry on for days. It's involved with music and group and chanting and fasting, most importantly. So the 5-day experience we witnessed with the Bwiti is something very removed from the Ibogaine clinics. And it's I have a dear personal lifelong friend who actually recently lost his life to his addictions. And one thing he told me before he passed was that at the Iboga clinic he had attended, one of the patrons there, one of the employees, actually said he was a previous addict, and said to my friend that it had taken him 7 goes until the Iboga really stuck. And so I unfortunately believe my friend felt he had 7 relapses left, which is never the case and is never something you want in an addict's head. So again, it can't be stressed enough that there's greater efforts that need to be placed in order to bring back some of the original Bwiti ceremony and tradition and culture surrounding Iboga use, and bring it into the scientific and clinical application, which is being used today as a very successful medicine, but obviously not in a perfect manner and not in every case. So again, my name is Roger Moore, and I really thank you for joining me.